Hi, and welcome to November's version of Literature Out Loud, brought to you by ThunderStream. We are focusing on Aspen authors, read by two of Aspen's most wonderful readers. We're going to be hearing from Tom Egan, who is going to be reading two pieces at the beginning and at the end, one by Joe Henry, who still resides at Woody Creek. He has written a beautiful book called Lime Creek. If you haven't read it, you should. He's best known as a songwriter. Lime Creek was put out in 2011. After Tom reads his first piece, Lon Winston is going to be reading from Finding Yuri, which is Sandy Munro's beautiful piece about finding his father through lost letters that were written between his parents during World War II. Now, Lon will be able to tell you a little more, but he knew Sandy pretty well at Great Divide Music due to the mandolin playing. And then Tom is going to come back with that stalwart of literature and of Aspen's history, James Salter, from his book called Dusk. It's a piece called Dirt, and not too many people know it, but James Salter had a big hand in resurrecting the Aspen Writers Foundation, which is now known as Aspen Words. So we owe him for that. He came to Aspen in the 1950s, and he died in 2015. So he had a nice run, and Aspen benefited from him greatly. So without further ado, I would love to introduce you to Tom Egan and this beautiful piece by Joe Henry called Passages.
Thanks, Dennis. And before I read it, I would like to mention, as locals, we tend to know a lot of other locals, and I've had the pleasure of meeting both of the authors I'm going to read with, Joe Henry and James Salter, and they're really Western guys, and I'm going to be reading a couple of what I would have to consider Western stories. And with that in mind, I'm going to go into this, and it does kind of move around a little, so try to keep listening to where the story's going, and I'm sure we'll all get there at the same time. So here we go. This is Passages by Joe Henry. When my mare died, Luke says, the day we put my mare down, I hadn't been able to ride her for over a year because her back had gotten so bad. And Spencer had told me that she would have had to be put down someday because eventually the pain would just be too much for her. You could run your hand along her backbone and feel the muscle wince up as you passed over these arthritic edges that had grown there, until finally she could hardly lie down nor stand back up again. I'd go into her stall and she'd move back and forth from off one foot onto the other, trying to find one position of relative neutrality that maybe would hurt her a little less. And so I finally had to admit to myself that leaving her like that was more cruel than the alternative. Spencer was away on business, and I'd gone down to the barn to grain her early one Saturday morning, humping my shoulders up at how cold it was right at the beginning of October. And I remember cutting more corn into her feed for the heat we'd be taught was generating digestively or something. And so I emptied the bucket of it into her trough and then took some of it in my hand as she began to move over to that side of the stall. I put my arm across her withers, speaking to her as she nuzzled the grain off my open palm, and she nickered deep down in her throat. And I remember watching her great gentle eyes as I spoke to her, until it suddenly hit me, as if she'd spun around and nailed me. It suddenly hit me as I talked to her eyes, just how much pain she was in. And all the while she kept mincing from one foot to the other as she continued to sidle her way over to the grain trough. So I stormed back through the kitchen, past Whitney, who's still at the table eating and reading a sports page, and looking up at me as I'm dialing the phone. He says, "What is it?" I look in his eyes as the line opens, and I say, "Stony?" And Whitney keeps watching me with his spoon in his bowl as I ask our vet, Stony Walls, if he could come over that morning for my mare, which was our mother's horse that she'd raised from a foal. And I say, I think she's just hurting too bad anymore. And Stony says, He'll be right over around 9 o'clock. I sit down at the table with my own bowl and pour out some of the breakfast food, and Whitney asks, "What time?" I tell him, and he buries himself back in his paper while I try to eat, staring out the window as morning comes on bleak and gray. And then Whitney says, without looking up, "Today?" And I answer him without looking back at from the window, "Today." I go back down to the barn, and I soon hear Whitney start up the backhoe and chug away, and then as it begins to run smoother and quieter, its sound fades down towards the meadow. The mare's still eating at the trough, and I bring her a bucket of fresh water, so she looks up from the grain and drinks, and then goes back to her feed as I begin to brush her down. And I work over her slowly, remembering her through all the years of my life with the winter hair already on her. And all the while, the sound of her eating in the dim emptiness of the barn is a peace to both of us. I rub my free hand over her, following my other hand with the brush, and then comb her long, thick tail and finally her mane, too. And for a moment, she stops the grinding in her jaws and turns, just looks at me, and then bows her head over the grain once again. I run my hand down her leg and kneel beneath her, and then lay each leg in turn across my thigh so I can clean her hooves. She hadn't had shoes in over a year since we'd stopped working her, and I remember thinking how good her feet looked, all trimmed up, even and all. My lifting her feet troubled her, though, for she continued to shift back and forth and from side to side, and so I worked quickly, letting her lean her weight against my shoulder. There's a white Y-shaped scar between the second and third knuckles of my left hand that runs into the webbing between those two fingers that reminds me of a day a couple of years ago when we were out looking for strays and somehow ended up all the way over in the Whiskey Basin where I'd never been before. We come out of the timber just at dusk, and there's an old settler's cabin down below, and I know we need to be getting back. But instead, we keep on across the abandoned pasture that's all gone to sage and scrub oak, and past the corral that's twisted over and buried in the tall grass beside the fallen down barn, until we approach the disused ranch house with the evening star, Venus, I think it was, hanging just above the caved-in roof. And with all the windows poked out too, like some old veteran of some ancient war, still dressed in the tattered, faded remnants of his uniform, and with his skeleton's eye sockets staring and lifeless. And I knew I should have dismounted and led the mare on foot in case there was a wire somewhere that I couldn't see, but it was late, and I told myself, she'll be all right. But I knew even before she stepped between two of the old rotted fence posts that I was wrong. She steps up again, begins to lift the hoof out of the dust, and the refuse of decayed leaves and time somehow seemed to slow down almost to a standstill. And to her right forefoot begins to come away from the darkening ground, and with it, a careless loop of barbed wire that's snared about her fetlock. And as that hoof lifts higher than it should for the next step, she begins coming back on her hind legs slowly and slowly, so the front of her reaches even higher still and paws at the dark sky as if she were trying to touch Venus, which by then shines as bright as a miniature moon. And as I'm trying to coax her with infinite care, come girl ahead, and down with my voice and my spurs, she overpasses her balance, tumbles backwards, and with a shriek of fright as I crash down too, with her on top of me. She rolls across me, and as my body turns in the dust, I sense her arcing high above me, shrieking again at Venus and at that dark barbed stubbornness at her foot that still won't let go. And waiting, but where she finally breaks herself free and falls back to earth. And waiting, but where the steel-shod hoof, as final as nightfall, comes crashing down on my hand, my left hand, and the force of it seems to throw me just again in the red but tasteless dust, leaving only an echoing silence that dims to black. Until, however, later, I don't know when, I feel the reins that must have fallen over her head brushing past my face, and then the soft skin of her muzzle and lips as she nibbles at the ground where I lie, seeking my touch. I'd finished my grooming at that point, and her eating, and unconsciously I glance again at the scar between my fingers as I fasten her halter, and then lead her out into the dull morning. We walk far down the knoll that fronts the ranch along the creek, and she drinks again, and then we move back along the rising slope, where we can drop down through the dense wood and into the clearing. Whitney's machine was quiet by then, and I knew he had finished. He'd meet Stoney back at the house and take him down to the meadow in the old uncovered Jeep that had also been there as long as I can remember. The trees are all bare, naked white trees that rise all around us, and we walk across a silent carpet of mottled golden leaves as we pass through the wood. It's still real cold, and the breath vapor puffs out from both of us as I walk beside her with the lead rope slack in my hand as if she knows where we're headed, although I know it is really just the downgoing of the hillside. We finally come out of the trees at the far side of the clearing, for I had glimpsed the backhoe and so have taken us the long way around as if we were trying to evade some mortal force that awaited us with a great yellow arm, which indeed we were. I walk up against her so her cheek brushes against my arm as we go. I know they're waiting for us across the field, but I'm having a difficult time turning back towards them. And so we keep walking further and further away in the direction of the barn and home. We've walked enough so that her stride is evened out and she seems to move without any lameness at all, and I dwell on her familiar, innocent face as it swings up against me with her step. As we approach the rise of the hill that climbs up to the lowest corral, I will myself to turn away, and we move quickly back towards where the Jeep and the machine are parked and where the two men await us. Whitney comes over to me as I approach and takes the lead rope from my hand and moves a few steps off with the mare as she begins grazing. Stoney is leaning against the Jeep and begins to fix a syringe with the contents of a vial that he's taken from his jacket. "Stoney," I say, and he says, "Morning, Luke." I'm awful sorry. And the way he says awful goes straight through me as I look at him working his gear, and I'm reminded of what a kind and gentle man he is behind all his gruffness, and that for all the years I've known him, I have never seen him be harsh with an animal. I suddenly hate the look of his instrument, though, and without looking up, he says, "It's the best way, son. You know me and your pop came from the old school of getting things done, but this is the best way. She'll just kneel down in the grass and then lie over and be done with it." And I say, "Just as long as it's quick enough so it won't be a hurt to her." And he says, "Don't you worry, son. This here is enough for two animals her size, and I'm giving her all of it. If and she feels anything at all, it'll be the first moment in all this time when she wasn't hurting." Whitney brings her alongside the deep slash he's dug in the raw earth with the backhoe and hands me the lead rope. And I'm holding her face against me, my fingers under the straps of the headstall with my thumbs rubbing at the soft corners of her mouth, which was something she always liked. Stoney moves next to her and rubs his left hand flat along the length of her neck, and suddenly jabs the needle that he's holding with his other hand into the vein that runs there, and there's a bright instance of blood that he closes off with the syringe. Then he depresses the plunger, and almost immediately one of her forelegs starts to bend as I keep her great head against me, trying to hold her upright, even as she crumbles under me and rolls onto her side with her legs facing the hole. Stoney kneels down and feels at her chest and says, "She's gone, boys. Her heart'll beat on for a few more moments, but it'll just be the reflex." Whitney kneels down and replaces Stoney's hand with his as Stoney stands back up and says, "I'm going to run up to my vehicle. I meant to bring a scalpel to dissect the top of her backbone, see what actually that looks like, lest if you boys don't mind." And Whitney says, "It's still beating." And I say, "No, I don't guess it'd make any goddamn difference now anyway." And so Stoney gets in the Jeep and goes off. I kneel down next to Whitney, and he moves aside, and I lay my hand up against her and feel her heart beating raggedly within her. I watch at her dead face with her eyelid nearly closed, and she groans, so I stay there on my knees. And her heart, which had been racing against the inevitability of the poison, seems to ease into a slower rhythm, and so I say to Whitney, "She's going now. It's slowing down now." But it keeps on with a dull and steady persistence until she suddenly takes in great inhalation of air and lets it back out, and I say, "Jesus," out loud to myself. And Whitney says, "What?" And I say, "She's still alive, Whitney." And he shakes his head and says, "You heard him, Luke. It's just the reflex." And I say, "I swear to Christ, Whitney." And he kneels down beside me as she breathes again and presses his hand under mine and says, "God damn it." And then standing back up, "Where the fuck is he?" The Jeep is finally audible coming off the hill, and as I watch her, her eyelid rises enough for me to see her living pupil. And I'm repeating over and over inside myself, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." and her heartbeat is slow and steady in her breast, which is still warm against my hand. Whitney has gone past the backhoe as Stoney drives up, and Whitney yells, "She ain't dead, Stoney." And so Stoney comes and kneels down where I am, and I stand back up, and he injects her again, and this time stays against her until there is an absolute nullity where his hand lies. I kneel at her head and move her eyelid back down, and then lift her face so I can move the halter around where I can unfasten it. And I think, now she is free. Now there is nothing to hold her back. And I let her go.
Beautiful.
Okay, well, it looks like it's my turn. I'm thrilled to be reading from Finding Yuri by Sandy Munro. Just a quick little side note. Deborah and I moved to the Valley in the summer of 1975. And on my birthday, she bought me a new guitar. I was a mediocre guitar player, and she bought it from Sandy Munro at the Great Divide Music Store in Aspen. And I started taking picking lessons and guitar lessons from Sandy, and even jammed with him and a couple of friends during that period of time. And 46 years later, I'm reading from this wonderful book that he wrote. So let's get started. Finding Yuri by Sandy Munro. He was the father I never knew, and so I don't know at all what to expect. I have this one fleeting memory. It has to be from 1944 when I was 3 years old. We were in our backyard in Columbus, Ohio. I see brown creased trousers, a white shirt with long sleeves rolled up, a big smile, tanned high forehead, and short, curly, dark blonde hair. He's brought home 2 balsa wood gliders, and we're throwing them in the wind. He shows me how to hold the plane, 2 fingers pinching the fuselage below the wings, and aims for the center of the yard. The first launch catches a big gust, and the glider disappears high over the house. We're laughing, and maybe I don't remember this at all. Maybe it's only a dream, but I like to think that I remember it and that this is the way it was. Until now, it's the only time I can imagine being with him, and I can still see the plane flying suddenly away. A few months after Mom died, I received a box in the mail from her husband, Ted, whom she'd married 10 years before. He had been gathering up her belongings and mailing them off to me piecemeal, so I didn't think much about it. The package, about the size of a shoebox, sat around for a week before I got around to opening it. One day, I picked it up, slit the edge with my penknife, and felt a little puff of old attic smell as I peered inside. There were 190 loosely packed letters back and forth between my parents, Yuri and Betsy, during my father's naval service in World War II. Many of his were mailed from the training base at Barbers Point, Hawaii, or later from the USS Enterprise, where he flew with Torpedo Squadron 90 during the last stages of the war in the Pacific. The first thing I could think to do was to buy a fireproof lockbox. I had been given a rare gift that I had no idea existed, a chance to get to know my father, and wanted nothing to happen to the letters. I read only two when the box first arrived, one from Yuri and one from Betsy. I held off for almost a year while I decided how to approach them, and now it's time to start reading the rest. I don't really expect to learn much about the missions he flew. All the envelopes are stamped by the naval censor, and there won't be much about the war itself. But to read his words and imagine him writing them will be enough to connect me. It's been killing me to delay all this time, and I didn't know what to do. In recent weeks, I began to feel that I should put down my thoughts as I read the letters. I could research his squadron's role in the war and try to put the story together in something resembling real time. Somehow, I feel apprehensive about beginning. What will I find? I do know that in the single letter that I read from Yuri, I saw a reflection of myself. I too was at sea aboard an aircraft carrier, separated for months at a time from my young wife and son, tied to them only by the letters we mailed to each other. Every letter meant the world to me, and from the one I read from Yuri so far, I can see that he felt exactly the same. You're at sea with your squadron of brothers, living, breathing, and fighting for the life of the world you believe in, but it doesn't take you to the core and reason for it all. It doesn't take you home. Most of the letters are from Yuri. Then there are 26 more still sealed, dated in January and February 1945. They're from Betsy, but he never had a chance to read them. The Enterprise was in the thick of the Pacific War by that time, and mail deliveries were sporadic. I've only looked over the envelopes and a few of the letters which aren't in envelopes in an attempt to get them in chronological order. What comes through at a glance is the devotion Yuri showed my mother and the tremendous strain of the separation on both of them. They tried to hide it by not talking about it and not thinking about it much, but it's all there in every page. I'm well into the letters of 1943 now, and Yuri has not yet joined his squadron. In May, he was sent to Fort Schuyler Reserve Officer Training Corps in the Bronx for his initial naval training. Fort Schuyler was built in the 1840s in the aftermath of the War of 1812 to protect the western end of Long Island Sound and hence New York Harbor from attack by sea. It was shaped very much like the Pentagon, but with one flattened side, and lay at the edge of the Bronx where the East River meets Long Island Sound. Yuri had left his new job as a chemical engineer in Princeton to volunteer for military service, and luckily was assigned to duty not too far from Betsy. She and I spent those 4 months with Alec and Barbara, Yuri's parents, in Greenwich, Connecticut. I was a year and a half old at the time, and my mother was 21. I spent today reading and taking notes. How strange to hear their voices in that time, the feel of their relationship and their comments about me. Yuri was 5 years older than Betsy, and his letters are filled with his daily activities. Like myself, he had to master Morse code, semaphore, that's shipboard flag signaling, and the basics of military life necessary to an officer in the naval service. Most of it is easy enough, but testing and competition are continuous, and low scores mean no weekends off to spend with his young family. Yuri was trading watch-standing duties with fellow trainees in order to escape to Greenwich whenever he could. Our family hasn't been separated at all until now, and they both seem careful not to talk about his immediate future, as he knows likely to be sent in the war zone. Like so many, that's why he joined up. For now, it's all about the adjustment of being apart for the first time and their efforts to spend together whatever time they can arrange. Only 4 months after beginning officer training, Yuri will be commissioned as an ensign in the U.S. Navy. September 9, 1943, 7 p.m. Darling, you have just left. And when you left, you took with you the most important part of me, all my love for you, without which my reason for being would be as nothing. Since we met, you have meant all my happiness to me, and you always will, for as long as we are both here, and perhaps even after. Keep yourself safe, healthy, and as happy as you can, remembering we have a long, big, happy life together ahead of us, and we are going to enjoy it to the utmost, trying to make and keep each other happy all the time, doing things for one another and being nice to one another. Goodbye for now, and take good care of little Stinker, and let no harm befall him. All my love to you is always, Betsy, darling. Love, Yuri. I am my father's only child, and I've wondered why my mother never mentioned the existence of these letters. But I'm beginning to get the idea. They contain the details of their daily lives, their financial worries, and even Yuri's diagrams of how to drain and fill the car radiator with antifreeze. But mostly, they are love letters. She calls him her dad. He refers to her as mommy or old gal. Even during these short separations, they find themselves lonely and are constantly reassuring each other of their love. Today, as I was beginning to read the letters from 1944, I shared a few passages with my wife, Mary Lynn. She pretends she isn't the old softy that I am, but she teared up immediately and told me that she couldn't bear to hear any more. It's emotional stuff. To have it coming straight from the pen of my father puts us in real time in a way that I had not anticipated. Somehow, I'm right there. It's sad. It wouldn't be that way if I didn't know how it all turns out. He's writing about their plans for the future and always of his love for my mother and me. But he doesn't know how the real story unfolds. I have to try to lay that aside and mind, let them have their dreams while they can. I have to feel that same optimism and not let it be shattered by the events that follow. At first, I couldn't figure out why there were no letters in 1944 until May, but it makes sense. They must not have been apart during that time. Yuri had graduated from officer training school in New York in February 1944 and had not yet left for California to begin his aviation indoctrination. I know he and Betsy went to Corpus Christi and San Diego for his flight crew training, and that they were together in California before he left for Hawaii to transition to torpedo bombers. At this time, Mom and I moved back to her parents' home in Columbus. I've only just started into the 44 series of letters, and there are a lot of them.
Random Notes on Mother's Day, 1944. As Shakespeare might write it, the moon shines bright. 'Twas on a night like this, a hope was born, a dream of better things to come, a son and heir, and all from mother's womb. As Ogden Nash might write it, it's nice to have a lover, it's swell to have a brother, I'd rather have my mother. As that great genius might write it, dear mother, me too. We have a fine crew, just Daddy and Sandy and Betsy, moo moo.
Aha, I'm back. Internet, thank you for reading. Versatile, ain't I? P.S. I'm also good at card tricks and making love to my wife. It's the way the letter ends. I'm starting to key into some funny similarities. I share my father's propensity for silly verse, which emanates from his own father, Alec. You'll hear more about this later, as Yuri's father, whom I knew better than my own father, is a part of this story. Just the other day, I found once again my dog-eared 1958 edition of The Expert at the Card Table, originally published in 1901. I carried the book aboard an aircraft carrier, the USS Constellation, for my senior summer cruise as a midshipman from the U.S. Naval Academy. For 2 months in 1963 on our training cruise in the Western Pacific, I spent hours at a time studying this mysterious book. It was written under the pseudonym S.W. Erdnase and reveals sleight of hand, card magic, and card cheating techniques in great detail with masterful prose. It's truly the Bible of card magic, and the author, perhaps for his personal safety, remains unknown. I've forgotten most of it, but there were a few years when I could put on a respectable card magic show. I can still do blind shuffles and card forces, but only well enough to fool an 8-year-old. Lastly, I'd like to think that I'm good at making love to my wife. But after 46 years, the jury may still be out on that one. It's October 1944, and Yuri has joined his squadron. They're training in Hawaii in preparation for joining their ship, the Enterprise. Already more than a seasoned combat ship, she's the storied flat top of the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, she was 150 miles west of Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked. The next day, she snuck into the devastated harbor for an overnight resupply, and by December 9th, she was steaming with a small task force in search of the enemy. They were in protection mode, patrolling the western approaches to the Hawaiian Islands, cycling in and out of Pearl Harbor every week or two for resupply. In June 1942, with her sister ship, the Hornet, she helped defeat the enemy carrier navy in the Battle of Midway. By October, she was the last U.S. carrier still fighting in the Pacific theater. Of the Hornet, Saratoga, Lexington, Yorktown and Wasp, the Saratoga was the only other flat top still afloat, though she had been heavily damaged and would require repairs. Pearl Harbor. The Big E had taken 6 enemy bombs with more than 300 casualties, but near the end of the year was sent to battle in Guadalcanal with the quickly repaired Saratoga. It had been a hell of a year for our Navy in the Pacific, but even worse for the Japanese. They never fully recovered from 1942, and the ship Yuri would soon join was pivotal throughout the fighting. At this point, he feels sure that he's going to be serving on the Enterprise, but he isn't able to confirm this information to Betsy. October 20, 1944. I dreamed about you again, although it's vague in my mind now, partly. Something about we were skiing, but we didn't have skis, just little red wagons like Sandy's. And then we went to a nice, cozy cabin to get warm. Dash, 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 dash. It gets pretty bad when I dream about you at night, as well as think of you all day. But I guess there is nothing I can do about it. Good night, sweetheart, or good morning, however you receive this, and all my love, Yuri. There's not much training time left at Barber's Point. Yuri is a fanatical letter writer and sends 6-page missives to Betsy almost every day. It's obvious that he worships her. He spends at least a page in every letter telling her how much he loves her and misses her, and how she's the sweetest and most beautiful girl in the world. I know exactly what he was going through because of my own shipboard separations. There's a difference, though. Yuri knew he was going into battle, and I knew that I wasn't. Although I served during the Vietnam War, I was stationed on a ship in the Atlantic, outside the arena of combat. His experience had to be so much more intense. It's especially painful to read the words about me and what kind of father he wanted to be to me upon his return. I don't think I ever really understood just how devastating my father's loss was to my mother until now. He and I were the totality of her life. She was 21 years old and had it all in front of her. Yuri talks of how important it is to keep their life simple, that the little things are all that matters. He talks about cooking and washing the dishes with her. He mentions lying in bed, reading and listening to the radio with her. He reassures her that he wants nothing more to do with the military or flying airplanes after the war is over, and hopes to get back his old job in Princeton. 1944 doesn't seem long ago, but little things in the letters keep illustrating how much times have changed. He talks about how there wasn't much to do in Hawaii. You could commandeer a Jeep with some friends and take rides up into the mountains, and there were these amazing water glasses that you could take into the ocean and actually see fish all around you. I know that Jacques Cousteau had just invented the aqualung, but hadn't realized that swim goggles were a brand new development. At one point, Yuri asks Betsy if she might be able to find a pair of water glasses in Ohio or New York, but cautions her that they might be impossible to obtain. They were made of rubber, which, like iron and steel, was restricted for military use. He mentions that they might cost as much as $6 or $7, likely prohibitive on their Navy budget. Meals at the military canteen were 35 cents for breakfast or lunch and 50 cents for dinner. Yuri complains about these high prices in Hawaii and that his meals were likely to cost $7 or $8 more each month than he had anticipated. October 25th, 1944. The letters from you and knowing that you are safe and well are an awfully big help to my peace of mind, and I would go nuts without them. But it just isn't the same as coming home from after work and watching you get dinner ready and doing dishes with you and all the little things we do together all the time, such as stopping you in the middle of dishes and giving you a kiss and hug, or having you sit on my lap and listen to the radio, or playing cards together, or just reading and looking over at one another. I think of all those things an awful lot, and it's because I love you so very much, darling. We have had to live in so darn many places. It will be nice to be in our own place again. I can't tell you how much I am looking forward to it all. I have also been thinking about Sandy and how hard I'm going to try to be a good daddy for him and make him my friend and companion as well as my son, and try to help and understand him. If I can do this, I will be awfully happy. Good night now, dearest, and pleasant dreams. With all my love, Yuri. Yuri sends this note on my 3rd birthday. We've been separated for about 3 months now, and it's the first time we haven't been together for my birthday. November 4th, 1944. I'm glad to hear that Sandy's turning out to be such a smart little egg, just like his mommy and daddy. So he told his little friends that his daddy knows God. Well, that's quite a large order. However, you can tell him that God is watching out for him and his daddy and mommy too. Yesterday, I had a long, hard day and then had to get up at 1200 midnight to go out and do some bombing until 0400 in the morning, which is the main reason that I didn't get to write. Right after dinner, I went to bed to get a little rest. I'm going to bed real early tonight too, since I have to get up again at 0300 in the morning and get to work. These hours are really rough, believe you me. I really don't mind night flying a bit, since I only go out with the very best of pilots. It isn't bad at all once you get used to not seeing anything. I am always busy in the air, since I'm generally in the lead plane in my practice attack, and I keep a lot of notes on what goes on so I can write up some kind of a report, among other things. Time for deployment is coming up quickly, and Yuri is busy training and flying, but he still he still finds time for letters, a little tennis, chess, and even the occasional bridge match. There are parties every week or two, a Saturday night dance, and illogical amounts of beer and liquor to consume. It's amusing to hear my father writing about the girls at the dances. The officers' club would scour the islands looking for female candidates to attend, and the single guys would draw straws choosing their dates, none of whom, Yuri points out, came close to measuring up to his girl back home. More than once, he mentions the bands composed of colored boys from the base and how good they are. Some evenings, the young officers would gather around the bands and sing songs for hours. Other times, they would borrow a record player and spend the night playing records while writing their letters home. Yuri and Betsy try to keep each other informed of the little events in their lives each day. They would send their spending budgets and bank account details, as well as mutual advice on all matters. They both smoked, and I noticed one of Betsy's budget items is her weekly carton of cigarettes. Yuri evidently enjoyed a few beers or cocktails, but considers himself a teetotaler compared to many of his squadron mates. In one of his letters, he is obviously a little over the edge, but he was more likely to help drag his compatriots home from the O Club than to be the problem himself. He has a liquor allowance in his budget along with everything else and can't afford to exceed it. It's another thing we have in common. I'm starting to see that we both like time alone, time to read and time for music. Yuri, like myself, is social to a point, but only so far. Twice he expresses frustration at not having time to read, but that he's trying to make room for it. I would occasionally hang out and play cards in the officer's wardroom, but more often found myself back in my little shipboard compartment, totally engrossed in the guitar and banjo. Most of the time I'd play alone, but I'd always be scouting around for someone else to play with, preferably someone who liked folk music and bluegrass. My last 2 years aboard the USS Wasp ended in late 1968, and during that time, my two best friends and fellow musician bandmates were able to talk the naval personnel officer in Washington, D.C. into assigning them to the Wasp for their final tour of duty. John Summers, Cash Cashman, and I met and band in Pensacola, Florida, together while we were going through flight training 3 years before. Now we are playing music aboard an aircraft carrier. Wow. Our band was the Clark County Coon Catchers Quartet, with the fourth member being Cash's blonde string bass, which he named Sydney. We put on shows for the ship's company and became the informal musical mascots of the Wasp. The skipper of our ship, Captain Ben Tate, was from Kentucky and a bluegrass fan. We needed a place to practice, and so he gave us a key to the secondary con. That was a large space just under the flight deck, right on the bow of the ship. There were 4 portholes looking straight ahead, 60 feet off the water, and complete duplication of all the controls necessary to command the ship in the event the primary bridge was destroyed in combat. There were radar units on stands, another giant helmsman's wheel, and the engine order telegraph, EOT, which sent messages directly to the engine rooms below decks. We had the place all to ourselves as we practiced our tunes, one of us often sitting in the huge leather captain's chair. It was surreal to be playing folk music on guitars, bass, and banjo while the Wasp plowed through the waves and aircraft were catapulted over our heads. At Christmas time in 1969, when I left the Navy, Cash and John followed Marilyn and me out to Colorado, where we've all been playing music ever since. Yuri didn't play a musical instrument. He wasn't yet at sea, but music, one way or another, kept popping up in his letters. Mom always stayed close to music. She always had a piano, and later in Maryland, found and restored a beautiful antique pump organ. I remember that when I was young, she loved to play and sing old church hymns. She'd have me sitting on a little footstool, pumping away on the pedals while she belted out the tunes. By the time I started school, I was learning to read the labels on my parents' record collection. I was careful with the records as I listened to them over and over again, sounding out the titles printed on the old 78s. There were Broadway collections, pop standards, hymns, and classical pieces. Later, when I was in high school, Mom completely lost her singing voice from cigarettes, but still sat down and played the hymns on her thundering rendition of Chopin's Polonaise in A flat. I'd almost forgotten about much of this until now. Thank you.
Fabulous. I'm going to read from James Salter's book Dusk right now. The name of this piece, again, is Dirt, and I had the chance to meet James, working with him at the Aspen Historical Society. For those who don't know, he wrote the screenplay for Downhill Racer, the probably many consider the best skiing film of all time with Robert Redford in it. So that's a reference that most people have, and you can find a lot of his, all of his writing virtually at the Pickens County Library. And without further ado, here is Dirt from the book Dusk by James Salter. Billy was under the house. It was cool there. It smelled of the unturned earth of 50 years. A kind of rancid dust sifted down through the floorboards and fell on his face like a light rain. He spit it out. He turned his head and, reaching carefully up, wiped around his eyes with the sleeve of his shirt. He looked back towards the strip of daylight at the edge of the house. Harry's legs were in the sun, and every so often, with a groan, he would kneel down and see how it was going. They were leveling the floor of the old Bryant place. Like all of them, it had no foundation. It sat on pieces of wood. "Feller could start right there," Harry called. "This one? That's it." Billy slowly wiped the dirt from his eyes again and began to set up the jack. The joists were a few inches above his face. They ate lunch sitting outside. It was hot mountain weather. The sun was dry, the air was thin as paper. Harry ate slowly. He had a wrinkled neck and white stubble along his jowl line. Death was coming for Harry Mies. He would lie emptied, his cheeks rouged, the fine old man's ears unhearing. There was no telling the things he knew. He was alone in the far fields of his life. The rain fell on him. He did not move. There are animals that finally, when the time comes, will not lie down. He was like that. When he kneeled, he would get up again slowly. He would rise to one knee, pause, and finally sway to his feet like an old horse. "Feller in town with all that hair," he said. Billy's fingers made black marks on the bread. "The hair? What's he supposed to be?" "I think a drummer," Billy said. "A drummer? He's with a band." "Must be with something," Harry said. He unscrewed the cap from a battered thermos and poured what looked like tea. They sat in the quiet of the tall cottonwoods. Not even the highest leaves were moving. They drove to the dump. The sun in the windshield was burning their knees. There was an old cattle guard salvaged from somewhere, some bankrupt ranch. It was open. Harry drove in. There was, in a field of junk and garbage on the end of the field, a bare field forever smoldering. A black man in overalls appeared from a shack surrounded by bed springs. He was round-shouldered, heavy as a bull. There was an old green Chrysler parked on the far side. "Looking for some pipe, Al?" Harry said. The man said nothing. He gave a short, half-hearted signal. Harry had already gone past and turned down an alley of old furniture, stoves, aluminum chairs. There was a sour smell in the air. A few refrigerators, indestructible, had fallen down the bank and were lying half buried in the stream. The pipe was all in one place. It was mostly rusted. Billy kicked aimlessly at some sections. We can use it, Harry commented. They began carrying pieces back to the car and put them on the roof. They drove slowly, the old man's head tilted back a little. The car swayed in and out of the holes. The pipe rolled in the rack. Pretty good feller, Al, Harry said. They were coming to the shack. He lifted his hand as they passed, but no one was there. Billy's mind was wandering. The ride to town seemed long. They give him a lot of trouble, Harry said. He was watching the road, the empty road, which connects all these towns. There's none of that stuff much good out there, he said. Sometimes he tries to charge a little for it. People feel like they ought to be able to carry it off for nothing. He didn't charge you. Me? No, I bring him a little something now and then, Harry said. Old Al and me are friends. After a while, claims to be a free country. I don't know, he said. The cowboys at Gerhardt's call him the Swede, but he never went in there. They would see him go by outside, papery skin, dangling arms, the slowness of age as he walked. He may have looked like a little Swede, but pale even from the mornings of invincible white, mornings of the great Southwest, black coffee in his cup the day ahead. The ashtrays on the bar were plastic. The clock had the name of a whiskey printed on its face. It was 5:30. Billy walked in. There he is. He ignored them. What'll it be then? Gerhardt said. Beer. On the wall was the stuffed head of a bear with a pair of glasses on its nose and a red plastered tongue. Above it hung an American flag with a sign, no dogs allowed. Around the middle of the day, there were a few people like Wayne Garish, who had the insurance agency. They wore straw ranchers' hats rolled at the sides. Later, there were construction workers in T-shirts and sunglasses, gas company men. It was always crowded after 5. The ranch hands sat together at the tables with their legs stretched out. They had belt buckles with gold-plated steer head on them. Be 30 cents, Gerhardt said. What are you up to? Still working for old Harry? Yeah, well, Billy's voice wandered. What's he paying you? He was too embarrassed to tell the truth. $2.50 an hour, Billy said. Jesus Christ, Gerhardt said. I pay that for sweeping floors. Billy nodded. He had no reply. Harry took $3 an hour himself. There were probably people in town would take more, he said, but that was his rate. He'd pour a foundation for that, he said. Take 3 weeks. There was not one day of rain. The sun laid on their backs like boards. Harry got the shovel and hoe from the trunk of his car. He was tall, carried them in one hand. He turned the wheelbarrow right side up. The bags of cement were piled beneath on a piece of plywood. He flushed out the wheelbarrow with the hose. Then he began mixing the first load of concrete. 5 shovels of gravel, 3 of sand, 1 of cement. Occasionally he'd stop and pick out a twig or a piece of grass. The sun beat down like flats of tin. 10,000 days of it down in Texas and all around. He turned the dry mixture over upon itself again and again. Finally, he began adding water. He added more water, working it in. The color became a rich river gray, the smooth face broken by gravel. Billy stood watching. Don't want it too runny, the old man said. There was always the feeling he might be talking to himself. He laid down the hoe. Okie dokie, he said. His shoulders were stooped. They had set of labor in them. He took the handles of the wheelbarrow and straightened up without straightening up. I'll get it, Billy said, reaching. That's all right, Harry muttered. His teeth whistled on the S's. He wheeled it himself, the surface now smooth and shifting a little from side to side, and set it down with a jolt near the wooden forms he'd built. Billy had dug the trench. Checking them one last time, he tilted the wheelbarrow, and the heavy liquid fell from its lip. He scraped it empty and then moved along the trench with his shovel, jabbing to fill the voids. On the second trip, he let Billy push the barrow, naked to the waist, the sun roaring down on his shoulders and back, his muscles jumping as he lifted. The next day, he let him shovel. Billy lived near the Catholic church in a room on the ground floor. It had a metal shower. He slept without sheets. In the morning, he drank milk from the carton. He was going out with a girl named Alma, who was a waitress at Daly's. She had legs with hard calves. She didn't say much. Her complacence drove him crazy. Sometimes she was at Gerhardt's with someone else in a haze of voices, the bark of laughter, famous heavyweights behind her tacked on the wall. There were water stains near the ceiling. The door to the men's room slammed. They talked about her. They stood at the bar so they could see her by turning a little. She was a girl in a small town. The television had an exhibition football coming from Grand Junction. They were thinking of her legs as they watched the game. She was like an animal they wanted. She smoked a lot, Alma, but her teeth were white. She was flat-faced, like a fighter. She would be living in the trailer park, Billy told her. Her kids would eat white big bread in big soft packages from the Woody Creek store. Oh, yeah? She didn't deny it. She looked away. Like an animal, it didn't matter how pure they were, how beautiful. They went down the highway in clattering steel trucks, wisps of straw blowing clear as they passed. They were watched by the coal eyes of cowboys. They entered the house of blood, its sudden bone-cleaving blows, its muffled cries. He didn't spend much money on her. He was saving up. She never mentioned it. They poured the side of the house that faced 3rd Street and started along the front. He thought of her in the sunlight that was browning his arms. He lifted the heavy barrow and became strong everywhere, like a tightened cable. When they finished in the evening, Harry washed off everything with the hose. He put the shovel and hoe in the trunk of his car. He sat on the front seat with the door open. He smiled to himself. He lifted his cap and smoothed his hair. Say, he said. There was something he wanted to tell. He looked at the ground. Ever been west? It was a story of California in the 30s. There was a whole bunch of them going from town to town, looking for work. One day they came to a place, he forgot the name, and went into some little restaurant. You could get a whole meal for 30 cents in those days, but when they came to pay the check, the owner told them it would cost $1.50 each. They didn't like it, he said. If they didn't like it, he said, there was the state police down the street. Afterward, Harry walked over to the barber shop. He looked like that musician. He had so much hair. The barber put the sheet around him. Haircut, Harry told him. Then, hey, wait a minute. How much will it be? The barber had the scissors in his hand. I see you've been eating over to the Greeks, he said. He laughed a little, almost shyly. He glanced at Billy. His long teeth showed. They were his own. Billy was buttoning his shirt. It was hot in the evening. The hottest summer in years, everyone said. The hottest ever. At Gerhardt's, they stood around in big dusty shoes. Shit, it's hot, they told each other. Can't get much hotter. What'll it be then, Gerhardt would ask. His idiot son was rinsing glasses. Beer. Hot enough for you, Gerhardt said as he served it. They stood at the bar, their arms covered with dust. Across the street was the movie house. Up toward the pass, the sand and gravel pit. There was ranching all around. A macadam plant, men like Wayne Garish, who hardly spoke at all, the bitterness had penetrated to the bone. They were deliberate, their habits were polished smooth. They looked out through the big, shore-like windows. There's Billy. Yep, that's him. Well, what do you think? They laid out phrases in low voices like bets. Their arms were big as firewood on the bar. Is he going to it or coming from it? The foundation was finished at the beginning of September. There was a little sand where the pile had been, a few specks of gravel. The nights were already cold, the first emptiness of winter, not a light on in town. The trees seemed silent, subdued. They would begin to turn suddenly, the big ones going last. Harry died about 3 a.m. He'd been leaning on a cart in the supermarket behind the stacks, struggling for breath. He tried to drink some tea. He sat in his chair. He was between sleep and waking. The kitchen light was on. Suddenly, he felt a bursting pain. His mouth fell open. His lips were dry. He left very little, a few clothes, the Chevrolet filled with tools. Everything seemed lifeless and drab. The handle of his hammer was smooth. He had worked all over, built ships in Galveston during the war. There were photographs when he was 20, the same hooked nose, the hard country face. He looked like a pharaoh there in the funeral home. They had folded his hands. His cheeks were sunken, his eyelids like paper. Billy Amstel went to Mexico in a car he and Alma bought for $100. They agreed to share expenses. The sun polished the windshield in which they sat going southward. They told each other stories of their life.
Beautifully read, gentlemen, both of you. Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank the authors. Great literature. You just can't beat it. So Tom, Lon, beautiful work. All of you people that are listening, next month we're looking forward to something called A Very Varied Christmas. We'll have things by Grace Paley, Truman Capote, and Dylan Thomas, read by myself, Mike Munro, and Beth Malone. We will look forward to seeing you then. Thank you, as always, to Thunder River Theater and the fabulous Sean Jeffries. We'll look for you next month. Thank you for coming to be with us. Bye-bye.